Good afternoon. Welcome to Clinicians Who Code Chat with the Honorable Brendan Keeler. And I'm going to pass it off to Andrew to set the stage for this conversation.
So very, very pleased to have Brendan for this conversation. Thank you for making the time. I think many folks may recognize him as the healthcare API guy, or is it just health API guy?
Health API guy is a little pithier, a little more fun.
There we go.
But I go by both.
Yeah. And the reason why it's exciting for me is I just can't get away from interop, right? So I think everyone knows I run an EMR company, and EMRs are sort of a node in a broad network of actors, stakeholders. But there's a very active node, connections to pharmacy, connections to laboratory, connections to other health systems, other EMRs, connections to state cancer registries, syndromic surveillance. I think there's just so much prescription drug monitoring programs. There's so many connections we have to make that have a real impact on our end users, and are in some cases sort of surprisingly complicated. And so I think it benefits everyone to develop an understanding there. And there's really no one, I think, more equipped to have the conversation than you, Brendan. So thanks for coming. Maybe you can tell us why are you the most equipped? How did you get here? And are you just a glutton for punishment? Or is there some other greater good you're seeking?
Yeah, it's Stockholm syndrome for sure. No, I don't know best, but I've been doing it for a long time. I needed a job out of college. Someone said, go work for Epic. Like, what the heck is Epic? Is that like a video game company or something? And then ended up doing hospital software, particularly integrations. And so connecting systems within the hospital enterprise. My career jumping around has been at each juncture solving different connectivity problems, different connections. And it all gets lumped under interoperability, but they're not all the same. They're all different workflows. And as you think about those different actors, the ones you mentioned and many others, Andrew, you start to see there's different tools, there's different maturity. And so I got to work at Epic on some of the connectivity within an enterprise, and then inter-enterprise, so between providers.
Yep.
I got to do to pharmacies. I got to do see a broad expanse of it. I got to go to Zeus and to Redox to see other angles, and then to FlexPA, where we did patient access as a really important actor that is increasingly having new options. And then now working at HTD Health, we help people navigate all those tools and all those different options and build the things they want. So yeah, I've had just a lot of perspectives. Maybe that's why I've been able to get to where I am.
You're talking about different tools, and we have, I think you would agree, Brendan, we have a default tool in this space. It's a 3-letter word. And it is, you probably, you know what I'm thinking.
You're the CEO of one of these companies, so I think.
Oh, well, okay. different 3-letter word. EMR is that one, but that wasn't the connections tool I was thinking of. I was thinking
APIs.
3-letter F word. Fax.
Oh,
when we talk about connections. See, maybe you've moved so far beyond this. You're living in the future already, right? But that 3-letter F word, fax, is how a lot of data moves and how a lot of connections are made. In fact, I think, would you agree? Is it the default?
Yeah, every workflow, fax is flexible, right? That's what the F stands for. And that means that anything you want to do and facilitate technically can be conveyed. Sort of like a telephone, right? Like that's another modality. People think about fax as a way to complete a workflow, but another modality for communicating is a phone call. And so those are so flexible that they're used as the baseline. They're used as the standard way we might,
it's like a catch-all. The kitchen drawer we all have with everything, the old sunglasses, the leftover gum, the spare keys, everything goes in that drawer. That's what
totally, because because it works, because it can work. Like, I mean, it works in the sense it will be done. Is it the most effective? Is it the most efficient? Is it wasteful? Is it time consuming? Those are different factors, but at the end of the day, it's ubiquitous. And for technology, for connectivity, connections, ubiquity matters. Being able to use it uniformly matters.
Yeah, I mean, we have some moments that I always that are interesting for me in talking with so many different healthcare providers. So when we get to interoperability and there's sort of questions around, for any one EMR may have different capabilities and different types of interoperability in different regions, subject to other conditions, etc. But every now and then I'll hear something like, please tell me you do better than fax. You know, and I think to myself, wow, it's really an honor that you think that I or my company, that we could have the power to do better than fax, right? That as if, I mean, Brendan, you're the one with the direct line to the president, right? You've got his cell phone number, you're texting with him about health policy, and you know, still we have fax. I'm like, you know, it's an honor that you think one EMR company could control the rails and ramps, so to speak, after the article that you wrote, which, by the way, if folks listening to this haven't read that, go read it. It's fantastic, but it's, you know, we don't control it. And so that sort of that's the first layer of the onion of like, well, who can make this better, and what does this even mean, and how do we unpack this very abstract concept of interop? And I think a useful way to do it is to pick a case, right? That's interesting. We can sort of pick it apart, and we can look at it from a few different lenses. One lens you're just remarkably steeped in is the regulatory aspect, and that drives so much of this. Why? Actually, I wonder, like, why is it that we don't have, you know, an EMR CEO can be asked, why don't you please tell me you do better than fax? And it's like, well, I can't really answer. I don't even have the purview or the jurisdiction to do better than whatever the rest of the community involves. And so it ends up in regulation. Right? Yeah,
I mean, there's a couple different routes that each of these problems set get a ubiquitous digital network, because that's what they're saying. Can you do better? They're saying, is there something digital, or is there just another pathway to convey a message, to convey a request, to convey data? And digital networks in all industries get built either by the incentive structures of the industry demanding that it gets built, right? Like Visa was, you know, MasterCard, credit card networks. Those came about as payment tools because banks said, oh, we can actually do this and facilitate broader acceptance by merchants and much more volume and all these things. And so industry consensus and collaboration is certainly a way that networks can be built, and digital networks can supersede fax or phone calls or in person, right? Like, as another modality.
That's a great point. That is another fallback, is come by.
Just come to the office, right? The branch, right? Like if you're a bank, there's the physical branch. And so those go away, or those get less important as digital mechanisms come into play. So there's consensus, and there's or not monopoly, but if a player is big enough to have their own intrinsic network effects, they can jumpstart a network. And we see that in healthcare. Epic has done that largely for the Care Everywhere network that's turned into Care Quality. These networks provide the retrieval of clinical data between providers today. And that came from sort of Epic saying, let's bootstrap this within our community. And other people said, oh, that's great, we want to do that. And then Care Quality and Commonwealth came into being. And so you see, that was not a regulatory push, although there is now a regulatory push to extend those concepts, make them ubiquitous. But that's, you know,
market power enough. There's like a tipping point when one actor has incentives that ideally are aligned with other private actors, but they have a tipping point of power to initialize, right?
Yeah, to create an atomic network. That atomic network in a geography or a user base can then jumpstart and spread. And then there's regulatory, when there's no incentive, or the incentive is slow, and the private market fails to adopt or create a digital solution, a ubiquitous digital solution, because of private competition, when the benefits of collaboration don't outweigh the benefits of strong competition.
Yeah.
And regulatory comes into play. And we see that is fairly effective for a number of instances in healthcare, a number of workflows, and the jury's still out for a bunch of them, but they're trying. We certainly try with regulation in healthcare.
Let's take two cases that I think illustrate how broad a range of outcomes and maturity levels, so to speak, we have. On one is something I think clinicians, our folks in the audience are maybe even take for granted, which is prescribing a medication electronically. So if we call that the sort of the use case is, I need to prescribe my patient a medication, and implicit in that, I want to do it electronically. And then contrast that or compare it to, I want a notification ASAP when one of my patients, which, like, how do you determine that? When one of my patients is admitted somewhere, maybe an emergency department, maybe somewhere else, but two very relatable use cases. I want to prescribe a medicine, and then I want to be notified ASAP when my patient is admitted somewhere. And there's like, let's just unpack sort of the different aspects of those, right? Because I think my first assessment to kick it off would be like, the prescription one is like very different power dynamics, incredible uniformity in implementation, and then the getting notified for admission is the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, so like there's a maturity to networks and a ubiquity to networks. And so prescribing, when I started my career, was not ubiquitous. It was there in a digital form, but like fax was still very common. And it's still a fallback behind the scenes for some use cases today. And so private industry pushed it forward, e-prescribing. And they said, let's create the SureScripts network. We're a conglomeration of pharmacy chains and others that are going to do this because we can get more volume. We can reduce a bunch of waste. We can have more control.
That was a private market incentive alignment that PBMs say, we'll all do better if we make this work really well.
Yeah. And then the fuel to the fire was the US government giving, and still giving to this day, a push, because they require it for certified EHRs. They required it prior to the meaningful use program. They require it as part of cures. And so all these regulatory pieces continue to make e-prescribing be adopted. And it's also now a market expectation. It's a non-question. Like if you would say, hey, we're going to fax you something, or here, patient, take this paper prescription, it would break from the default. It would break from the expectation. And so you see a very mature, ubiquitous capability. Can it be improved? I think you could ask like Otto from Photon Health and other players, but like, yeah, it can be improved. There's ways we can do better, and there's drawbacks to a single network with no competition existing to fulfill a capability. Like imagine if Visa was the only way.
Case in point, the settled lawsuit.
Right, exactly.
But we have examples of monopoly at the utility level, and you talk about utilities, Interop as a sort of collection of utilities. We have these all the time. They're what we generally refer to as utilities on our, personal accounting line items, right? And what happens is if a utility does have a monopoly, but it's not in fact associated with a theory of harm, we just need to regulate that monopoly, right? And sometimes it turns out that it may be good to have that uniformity, right? And if people can break into it and we get another e-prescribing network that has similar functionality or better, and we can get some competition, fantastic. But in the meantime, if we contrast it to the admission example, right, and how much we struggle as end users, clinicians, like, do we get, how easy or hard is it to get real-time notifications when a patient is admitted?
Yeah, I mean, and I would actually put that somewhere middle maturity. Like there are networks. There's Patient Ping, now Bamboo Health. There's Collective Medical, now Point Click Care. But they're geo-specific, right? Like they're in a certain state, they're not in another. There might be a state health information exchange, so like smaller players. And so to stitch it all together and get a ubiquitous national coverage at a national level becomes really hard. But depending where you are, if you're just like a provider in North Carolina, okay, well, their state HIE is really good and all the ADTs run through it and you can actually use that capability. But to have it be completely uniform, to know what it is, to know that it works anywhere in the United States, we're not there yet for that one.
Yeah. So if we compare it, like e-prescribing, regardless of what EMR you use as a clinician, it's going to be on the SureScripts rails, and that's going to work nationally. It's a one-time integration, and it's there, right? A little bit of simplification or reduction in that, but pretty good characterization. On the flip side, depending on which EMR you use, depending on which intermediary they might be integrated with, these aggregators like a Bamboo or a Point Click Care, formerly Patient Ping and Collective Medical, as you said, it may not help you as a clinician if you're not in one of the regions that they cover. And if that's the case, then the question is, well, what's the local HIE configuration? And further to that, is the specific emergency department that you suspect your patients will be utilizing, is that connected to the local HIE in such a way that a real-time message can be sent?
Totally.
Yeah.
And what's annoying about this one, Andrew, just as a small deviation, is like the government actually tried to push this forward, right? They tried to give fuel to it. So the CMS made a rule about ADTs being required and everyone needing to send them, but they didn't specify how. And so they made adoption happen, but it means that there's all these mechanisms and there's direct messaging that could be sent across. And so it didn't make it uniform, and it didn't make it a single on-ramp for this particular capability. So yeah, there's definitely more variety. And in some places, some states and stuff, still a lack of a capability, like where there's not a state HIE and the private vendors don't serve.
Yeah. So Brendan, you mentioned on-ramps as mechanisms to get to these rails. Can you just talk about how we should think about on-ramps and what functions they serve?
Yeah. So when you have the network, a network is great because it's ubiquitous, but because it's ubiquitous, it is slow to modernize. So like they get stuck, right? Like they get stuck with an old standard, like claims data. If I want to send a claim, the clearinghouses are now ubiquitous. It's a ubiquitous network. That's an ancient standard, X12. And so that you see that calcification of the network as networks get more ubiquitous, they have older standards, they can't move to something easier to use. So as a clinician and as a coder, you might say, I don't want to learn like, it's like going back and having to read ancient Mesopotamian. You don't want to, right? Maybe you want to read the text that they wrote, but you don't want to go learn that language. And so on-ramps say, you know what? I can provide value. I can make it easier to the clinician or to the person who's coding by providing an API, application programming interface, or maybe even a user interface, just a little widget that takes care of that on-ramps onto these networks. So you can benefit from the ubiquity, but have a much more modern approach. It's easier to implement. It's easier to use. But you do pay margin, right? You do pay some for that capability. And so a great analogy in banking and finance is Visa and MasterCard, the credit card networks are ubiquitous, but they use old standards under the hood. And so Stripe is a very popular company that exists to on-ramp people onto that, to give them an easy application programming interface to plug into their code, to plug into their software, and to utilize the benefits of the network at a much faster pace than learning Mesopotamian.
Do you see a relationship between the usability of ramps, effectiveness of ramps, and the size or growth of the rails?
Yeah, I mean, what are some things to draw out? The older the rails, the more value there is to an on-ramp. And so if there's a ubiquitous network that's old, you'll see an on-ramp that's successful and large and helps grow the network. So you see Stripe and credit card networks. You see Twilio, the popular, very large company at this point, that on-ramps to the SMS network, to send messages. There's a company called Lob that allows you to send mail, the mail network, USPS. And so like any network,
use Bob
yeah, exactly, right? Like if your
and
software, you
patient
need these,
invoices. Some patients still, want to get the letter.
it's the fallback. But if you're in the digital era and you want to use these fallbacks, you need an on-ramp. And so, yeah, if there's this arbitrage between the age of the standard, the complexity, and the expectations of the modern developer times the size of the network, the ubiquity, you see on-ramps for it.
Yeah. Yeah. The two examples we talked about, pharmacy, drug ordering is point-to-point, specific clinician to a specific pharmacy. That's part of the SureScript certification. You have to specify the destination pharmacy. So we'll call that point-to-point. Similarly with the ADT admission notification in real time is point-to-point. Then there's another point-to-point I want to talk about, which is referrals, both the closed loop of referrals and how that's different from HIE, which we think about, you gave the example of care anywhere, care everywhere. I always get those confused. I don't know if there's still two different things now.
Care quality, everyone's in that network. Care everywhere, just the Epic network.
But then there
Care
was
anywhere. Care anywhere, they sunset that terminology.
Okay, that's helpful for my brain to have. Yeah. Okay. So what became care quality, where you can sort of a participant in the network can add data to the network, make it available, or at least like make it known that the data is available, right? And the actual technical details of where the data is stored, et cetera, we can not get into, but it's in a sense not point to point. It's not a specific transmission of data from source to origin, but rather a notification that there's like a pool or a repository that's accessible under certain uses, right? And there was some conflict about this recently on when data that's accessible is being used or accessed for the right reasons. But I think this is another useful contrast. So you talk about HIEs and interest in HIEs, on-ramps to HIEs versus, and I'll just pick this other really important point-to-point use case that I think a lot of clinicians suffer from on both ends, which is I'm a clinician, I need to refer a patient out, and I want to provide the relevant portion of the medical record to facilitate the referral. And then on the receiving end, I want to receive that referral and integrate the medical record so that I can actually reason about it. And then I want to close that loop as a specialist and send my consult report back to the referring physician. And so like the role, like HIEs versus this sort of point-to-point closed loop referral, I think it's an interesting case to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, so health information exchange, HIEs, regardless of how they're built, whether it's a repository or decentralized, you're just sort of hinting at that. And there's a variety of them. They're meant to solve a different workflow from the referral one. They can help with the referral one, but the workflow that they replaced, like pre-digital, is I show up at Dr. Hines' office and I say, Dr. Hines, like I need care right now. And you say, I have no idea who the hell you are. I need to see your history. So you call somebody or you fax them and say, can you send over their records? And so that pull mechanism, that query and response, that's what's replaced in the digital era with these health information exchanges by and large. So it's the ability to pull the clinical history, the record for transfer of care. It's a yin and yang with a referral or a push, right? If I know I'm going to see Paulius and I'm saying, hey, like let me just go push to him, that fits alongside these sort of emergent or pull use cases. But what the health information networks, these HIEs accomplish today is that query model. That's what's ubiquitous, semi-ubiquitous, 70% ubiquitous today, and very powerful.
And that data, for the most part, right, if we talk a little bit about the shape of it, structure of it, you mentioned, frustrating part of the ADT reality is there was some regulatory push behind it, but it was insufficiently specific. It was too vague. And the lack of a concrete implementation guide prevented broad adoption, right? And I'll never forget when I stumbled across this. I can't even remember how I stumbled across it, but like I found this PDF document on a government site This is like 10 years ago. So we're talking like MU is in its thing, and it was about consolidated clinical document architecture. And in this document on slide, I think it was 17, was a page. This is a US government document from our friends at ONC. And it was like, the structure is an unstructured blob, literally that sentence, which is like hard to reason about. And I think about CCDAs and sort of what the nature of the data on HIEs and the role that they play. How do you, for the audience, maybe characterize a bit like are these like full medical charts with all the detail and CCDA with the terminology codings? Are they like PDFs that may have actual text data inside, or maybe images that need to ultimately be OCR'd? Are they HL7 files? Are they X12? Are they DICOM? Like, what do we see? What's in these so-called HIEs?
Yeah, so the whole of the 2000s was like trying to figure this out. It was trying to figure out like, how do we do this type of exchange for treatment purpose of use? And what they landed on after like iterating through this is called the continuity of care document. It's CCDA. And there's prior iterations with a PDF inside of this structured document. And you still see that out there because it's the relics, it's the refuse of that era of the 2000s where people built that capability, and it's just still out there. So you'll see that by and large you see a patient level CCDA. And so that is, for this use case, what does Dr. Hines need to know? What does he need to pull when Brendan shows up? And so that's PAMI, that's problems, that's allergies, that's medications, that's immunizations.
Yep.
It's recent labs.
The regulatory, we got to get like a marketing person in ONC here, because like the PAMI, problems, allergies, medications, immunization, is a subset of the CCDS, core clinical data set, right? That was in the regs. And CCDS was the data content that was supposed to be in CCD format, continuity of care document format, which would then be wrapped in a consolidated clinical document architecture, CCDA file. It's like every one of those has CCD in it. And I like can barely keep track of my own voice saying.
And now we're upgrading to USCDI. Like, yeah, it's just these series of acronyms. But like the general concept is just what's that little summary that is needed? What's the core information that's needed for transfer? It's not. Increasingly, there's more and more of like the whole record from some of the implementers on these networks, but that's the baseline that you see from not the lesser EHRs, but the less mature EHRs you see from Athena and eClinicalWorks is just a one patient level continuity of care document.
So that's out there. Go ahead, Paulius.
Yeah, we're kind of talking how this data arrives to these destinations and how it's formatted, but I kind of wonder if you have opinions about who that data is generated by and whether that's going to change in the future. Like right now, it's, clinicians are the gatekeepers, so to speak, of what gets entered into all these different formats. But with open notes initiatives and other regulations that make data accessible to patients, we're like in the read phase. Will there ever be a write phase for patients that, permeate these HIEs just as much as the clinical notes do?
So patients have had the right to their data since HIPAA. And that has been, that pathway, that exchange between actors has been done by the ways we discussed, the fallbacks, fax, in person, etc. The government has consistently reaffirmed that right and added digital pathways. Meaningful use gave the right for us to log into our portal and download a CCDA document. Meaningful use part 3 added the API capability that we could connect the apps of our choice and pull down via an API, although they didn't really specify what kind. The Cures Act said, let's double down this. It's got to be a FHIR as a format, popular standard, FHIR R4. It's got to be the USCDI data set. And so we see that as a ubiquitous capability, but it's not as easy. It's not as seamless as we'd want, because the act of logging into a patient portal, the act of remembering your password, the act of being provisioned a portal account is a lot of friction, is a lot of pain. And so people don't do it, or they can't do it. They hit the wall. And so the next layer of that is to use health information exchange networks to as a tool, as a how to accomplish something we've already done several hows, right? Like we've not that we're going from the floor, we kind of are. Like some people are still doing fax or phone calls to get their record, undoubtedly, all the time. But we have digital mechanisms that are out there that are in use that patients do use. And so the next layer is to say, okay, let's use a new how. Let's use the HIEs and to facilitate that. And while that's great because the HIEs provide this ubiquitous access to pull clinical data, which seemingly maps, it is a different problem set. And so I, as a provider, pulling data under HIPAA, have the right to pull data and liability if I pull it inappropriately. If I, however, as a patient, go and pull data via these HIEs, I could sign up as Little Wayne. I could pull Little Wayne's data. And so just utilizing it one-to-one to accomplish the goal is, using the hammer when you should be using the screwdriver. And so adapting the health information exchanges to identity proof, to, show that the patient has consented. Those are things that are happening right now. And ideally we get in place so that people can use health information exchanges in a way that makes it way less friction. There's way less friction than there is today with existing digital pathways or manual pathways, but also protects patient privacy so that we can't just go pull Lil Wayne's record, even if we want to.
And in the process that you just described, where do you think the market forces are most at play? Like, what's the most lucrative part of this step, where if you can even identify that, right? Because I think, wherever data flows, there's a ton of cash.
Right now, there's a regulatory arbitrage that's happening where somebody says, oh, I'm going to go abuse the HIEs to give patients their data so they can, but it's not to give to patients, it's to give to the law firms and to the pharma and to these other use cases that are facilitated with and through the patient. And so right now that's $100 a query, it's $100 a patient. Some of these less scrupulous companies are charging to facilitate that because they take on HIPAA liability, they take on regulatory liability. As these sanctioned pathways with identity proofing and other things come online, which TEFCA, a new regulation, hopes to instill and spread and across these private networks, right? Care Quality, Commonwealth, these are private initiatives. TEFCA is government backed. And if it can deploy individual access at scale, there's no one place of the value chain it accrues. PHRs can access data. Law firms with patient consent and identity proof can access data when they need to. The patient is empowered. And so I guess the identity proofers, there's some value that will accrue to them. But ultimately, we'll have a safer pattern and a more secure pattern and a better situation for patients in that world.
I'm looking at time here, and I want to make sure we hit one other aspect of maturity before we wrap up. The regulation that we painstakingly implemented at Canvas, and so many hundreds of other EMRs have, absolutely critical. Making data available to patients. Of course, it's their data. Making it available through either a CCDA or through FHIR resources. All of the regulation up to this point, with a few exceptions, has been, and I mean few, has been about access and reading or searching. And the writing or updating, whether that data is coming from a patient, let's say I'm a patient living with type 1 diabetes and I've used continuous glucose monitors forever, and I want to start to put that into my, have my established care team, and I want to write that data into my medical record because I want to have richer conversations with my care team. Or whether it's, point to point, one provider to another, Paulius refers to you, and you want that referral information, the suspected diagnosis codes, his assessment to be natively in your experience that has structured computable data in it. Maybe you could do things like even safely apply some autonomous agents on top to help you think through it, whatever it is. There's like all that stuff's not even a possibility yet because the writing of the data is so far behind the reading of it. I wonder how you think about that in terms of a problem, and whose problem is it to solve? And to a degree, this is sort of reflecting like, why haven't we given more attention to it? And I think the attention we have given has been effectively the ONC Reg B1 criteria, B1 and B2, which are like when you receive a CCDA, you have to make available for review and manual reconciliation allergies, medications, and problems. That's
So
it.
so what I would say, it's good that you add that last point. It's just like, what workflow exists today that you'd want digitized? And so if I'm talking about writing data, like, well, does some actor have the rights to write data? Should they be able to? And the only way you answer that is by saying, like, what's the workflow? And so amendments to the chart occur today, probably in some very non-digital form. Like I call them up and say,
a very manual form. Yes, exactly.
right. And if we say we need to solve that problem and make a digital pathway for it and make it ubiquitous, then we can do so as an industry, as a private industry. And then once proven out, the government will adopt those things. And so the US government, and compared to the Netherlands, where I lived, or some of the other countries I helped out with when I lived over the Netherlands working for Epic, is very much to a fault, waiting for private industry to prove out a digital pathway before they force it to be adopted. And so if anybody was making available a Fire-based API to do amendments, there was an implementation guide. And I think there is, Josh Mandel or somebody within the Fire community, I think probably has something, the Argonaut work group. But once proven out, once adopted, and they say, oh, this actually works, that's when the CMS and the ONC come in and say, we're going to actually add it to HTI1, HTI2, the subsequent regulations. And then that's a good pattern in some ways. I find it slow sometimes. I wish they would just mandate things, but it also means that they typically don't mandate really raw, implementation guides that aren't going to work. Not always true. The Da Vinci specs are, I think, an example of that, but like that's how they approach things. So just think about the digital, if you think about the pathways, the workflows, and what are they done today? How are they done via fax, in person, in an office visit? And then think about how we want them done digitally. That's the path to get them first to proven out with just by Canvas, and then by the industry.
If you think about like for our community, as we learn about managing source code and like having collaboration source code and this notion of a Git repository and forking and then merging, and we have the patient's record, maybe you have a lot of collaborators. You have a care team that spans 3, 4, 5, 10 different sites of care, all collaborating on it and merging it in such a way that it can be sort of authoritative, accurate, safe. There's so many safety concerns. You just said, who has the right, RIGHT, to write, WRITE, to your record? And that's a big question. These are all definitely unsolved.
I have one thing to add as a question, Brendan. You mentioned different countries, and you're a worldly guy. What do you like? I actually have no clue where US stands in relation to other countries, just in terms of these rails and networks and on-ramps. Like, for example, I know very superficially that Estonia is known to have a national EHR, and that seems to be pretty cool. But is it any better infrastructure-wise than what we have here, or they just have different problems?
Everybody has different problems and different, nobody solved the full superset of all workflows. But so if you look at any particular European country, they have different insurance models and different provider models, and thus their rails are all different. And so Estonia's a good one. They have identity really locked down, not just in healthcare, but
they're less than 1.5 million people though.
Yeah, right. The problem set is really small. So you can do things that may not scale or be harder to scale across the US with disparate regulatory regions. But just zooming in, there are lessons learned. And so like identity, foundational, when you solve that, you actually make a lot of subsequent problems a lot easier. But every country does things, better or worse. Like the Netherlands, unbelievably rock solid for diagnostic image exchange. Like if you, Paul, want to see, your patient's, any diagnostic, DICOM image across the country, boom. And that's a private network. There's some private networks in the US today for that, Life Image and others, but Ambra, but like, it's just not a regulatory priority. It's not on people's radar. PACS systems aren't regulated. And so it's much further off. Whereas we are much further ahead on discrete data exchange, this health information exchange. We're much further ahead on e-prescribing, although they're catching up. So yeah, you can actually, for each problem set, go and look across countries and say, where are they on that journey? Which ones have they solved or not even thought about?
What can you get our CWC community excited about for the next, say, 3 to 5 years, whether it's regulatory, standards, technology, ramps, rails, whatever it is, leave us on the up and up here.
Yeah, I mean, if you're excited by new capabilities, regulatory is a push for that. And so like if we say, what new capabilities are on the horizon? Prior authorization is coming in 2027. And so this API between providers and payers to digitally facilitate a very fax and phone call heavy process.
The pain of every clinician's existence.
Right. And I'm sure it's a very
long implementation.
It's a crazy implementation guide.
Yeah. So what is coming 2027 means the IG will be published.
No, it means there's technically supposed to be live, but we saw with patient access on the payer side that will take some adoption time to get through the kinks. But there's optimism, right? Like that will force a new digital pathway. There's the provider access API from payers. So as a provider, you can pull the claims without financial information and clinical data that a payer has in regards to your patient. And so that supplements the overall picture, but also gives you a really clean perspective of what they know about your patient. That's 2027 as well. So that's part of the same rule.
Yeah.
And lastly, there's HTI-1, which is the subsequent rule to the Cures Act. And that's pushing forward new capabilities for EHRs that they'll have to certify to in regards to clinical decision support, AI, some other things. And so there's new capabilities there. Before the election, we do expect one additional rule, HTI-2, and that may include write-back FHIR capabilities. That may include sort of these webhooks. So instead of FHIR today, where you have to pull information, we think this may be a subscription where an app can say, I care about a certain condition, or I care about certain orders, and then receive that push to them, which today is largely facilitated by HL7V2, or if at all, by any mechanism by an EHR.
Or some EMRs have webhooks. And
some modern, digitally native EHRs have.
Yeah.
So sounds like the things you mentioned really empower the clinical team quite a bit. Is there anything specific that empowers the patient that you anticipate that's coming along?
HTI-2 could include potentially some patient write-back amendment workflows. I do think we don't know what's in that rule. The CMS rule that prior auth is tied to, the provider access rule is tied to, that also empowers the patient further because they have access to their prior authorization information via API. So they can use it in the applications of their choosing. So additional fuel to the fire there. The price cost transparency rule that's expected, that would give patients access to advanced DOBs. So in progress pictures of what the cost might be.
Very cool. Well, I would say this is a perfect spot to wrap up. And Brendan, how do people find you and read about your work? Because you're probably the trusted source in our community. And so would love to send people your way.
Well, it's really nice to hear. Yeah, you can find me at Health API Guy on Twitter, on Substack. You can come talk to HDD Health, and we're happy to help people on their journey of building something, whether it's just strategy or development. Yeah, LinkedIn, Carrier Pigeon. any modality.
Any more
Back,
facts?
back to you,
Yeah,
yeah.
facts to me.
Once a year, you might be at a major conference in Las Vegas. You know,
That's right. That's right. I'll be in the HLTH conference, the health conference, typically. And who knows?
good stuff.
Well,
Amazing.
awesome. That's been
Thank you
great.
so much,
Thank you.
Brendan.